Thank you very much, Michelle. And it's a great pleasure being here. And some of you might know that my wife's American, so we have a really strong link to this country. She's from Delaware, and before you say, well, that's a very small state, she will want me to say to you, it's the first state. Okay, so just remember that before you're rude about the size of Delaware. Those of you from Texas or California or whatever. So no, it's a pleasure being here. And this topic, I think, is a very interesting one for me to sort of be part of a workshop in, because I think there are going to be cultural differences. I think there are going to be differences between how you think about this issue in America and perhaps how I think about this issue in the UK and in Europe more widely. Now, I think that's a very good thing. I think, because I want to challenge you a bit about how we think about mental health and the behavioral issues that affect people with Prader-Willi syndrome. Now, you may disagree with me, but I don't mind that at all. So I hope we can get a discussion, a debate going. And there are sort of roughly 3 parts to the sort of presentation. But please feel free to interrupt, argue, shout at me or whatever as time goes on. But I just want to start by saying that I have no declarations other than the fact that I have been involved with advising pharmaceutical companies on some of the trials. I suppose the only other declaration is I'm from the UK, but that's about it. Some of you would have been in Deepan Singh's talk, I think, a moment ago. Would that be right? And in some ways, I think this complements that really, really very well. But I want to start by challenging you, really, to think about what do we mean by mental health. So, you know, the title is, of my talk was Improving Mental Health of People with Prader-Willi Syndrome. What do we mean by mental health? And the tradition over the years, and particularly within my practice, within psychiatry, of course, has seen it in the form of pathology or mental ill health. So someone is mentally healthy because they don't have a mental disorder. They're not depressed, they don't have schizophrenia, they're not unduly anxious, and so on and so forth. But there's been this great move away from that to thinking from the positive side, not so much from the side of mental disorder or mental illness, but what do we mean about mental health? And therefore, of course, the research switched a bit to say what maintains mental health as opposed to what causes mental disorder. And I think both are required, but I think it's an important switch in the way one begins to think about these issues. And the World Health Organization, which I'm a great fan of, has really done a lot of thinking about this issue, about mental disorder, mental health, and so on. And this is just taken from a paper written by Galtaserri on behalf of the World Health Organization, in which he argues that we must think of mental health as more than the absence of mental disorder. And these are the phrases that are used in the paper: a dynamic internal state or equilibrium. And then things like the ability to recognize and express and modulate emotions, the ability to cope with adverse events and function socially. Now, all of those things you can see will be a struggle for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And increasingly, as we'll come to, I think one of the ways of thinking about the mental health of people with Prader-Willi syndrome is their ability to live within a world in which things inevitably change and things happen. And it's their problem with coping and managing that change that can be so difficult for them. Now, this sort of definition of mental health is equivalent or analogous to physical health. We wouldn't think of physical health as only being the absence of physical illness. We would think of it in terms of our ability to have energy and walk down the street or even go jogging or whatever it happens to be. So I think it's important. And if you therefore think in those terms, it moves you away from thinking about health as only a matter for health services. It's about the quality of the environment we live in. It's about the society you live in. It's about, for people with Prader-Willi syndrome or for people with disabilities generally, it's about the quality of support that is available to you. So that's going to be the theme. But anyone have any thoughts about mental health yourself? I mean, what would you add as describing good mental health? Any other thoughts or ideas, what you think would be good mental health? Yeah.
A good sense of humor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And people with Prader-Willi syndrome can have a good sense of humor. It can be a little bizarre at times, but I think it could be very good. Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? Flexibility. I think flexibility, evolution has shaped us to be animals that can cope with changes in the environment. If we weren't able to cope, if we didn't have that flexibility, there would be problems. Yeah. Empathy. Empathy is very, very important. And empathy is important in terms of you also to be able to, in a sense, understand the threats in your environment. And I think we'll come to this a bit. I think one of the problems for people with Prader-Willi syndrome is to be able to interpret what's happening in the environment, to appreciate whether someone who's coming towards them is someone who is feeling positive about them or is a threat to them in some way. Yes?
Put out a feeling of belongingness, but that is significant and meaningful to that individual.
Yes, it's a feeling of, but I'm just repeating a bit for the sake of the recording, but feeling of belonging, and then you said something about for the individual.
But that is significant to that.
Significant, absolutely. And that, of course, being part of a community. I mean, it may be just the family, it may be the school, it may be a club, it may be a church, whatever it is. And those are very important. And that's why I'm going to come to this, back to this issue, that mental health is not just about health. It's really, really important that. Okay, let's just, so people have begun to widen the idea of how we think about the narrower context of mental health. So we have sort of mental health here, but people now increasingly talk about well-being. And well-being is seen much more about the presence of positive attributes, a sense of contentment, a sense of worth, a sense of belonging, and so on. And then these concepts get expanded a bit further to think about quality of life. And this is about the life you lead in the context of the environment where you live, your opportunities for jobs, for recreation, for meaningful activity, and feeling again belonging within your community. And just to take a step back and say, well, what does the research tell us about some of these things? These more general concepts of well-being and quality of life, is what they tell us is really that there are societal, psychological, and biological factors that impinge upon well-being and quality of life. And for families and for people with a disability and for families who have a child with a disability, these things can be compromised. They can become more isolated in society. They can be more financially challenged because of having a child with a disability, and it's usually mum, but not always, has to give up work or whatever it happens to be. So I think in the discussion we have, it's really important, therefore, whilst there are going to be very important issues around the individual's health, we need to see it in this wider context. Of course, it may well be that someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, their behavior makes it very difficult for them to engage in activities. But of course, if you have someone with Prader-Willi syndrome who could engage in activities, but there are no activities for them to engage in because society doesn't provide for people with disability, then you've got a problem as well. And part of the wonderful aspect of being part of the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization is you hear those sorts of stories. They're sad stories. We heard recently of a family in Algeria where the mother, who really knew very little about Prader-Willi syndrome, but the only way she could support her now adolescent son was by basically locking him in the house, because there was nowhere for him to go. And when he did go out, his behavior was so difficult, she just felt she couldn't take him out. So, I mean, I think that if I was to ask what's the most important thing for mental health, I would say it's the quality of the society that you live in, the support being available to the person and to the family. And we'll come back to that. So think about these things in this wider way. Now, you may want to add to these lists. So this is the three components, if you like, of what I think is important for us to consider. So obviously, there's the person with Prader-Willi syndrome. And as repeatedly, I think I've heard people say during the conference, and this is very important, is of course someone with Prader-Willi syndrome is an individual in their own right with their own strengths and weaknesses. And there will be people with Prader-Willi syndrome that are able to cope with situations that other people with Prader-Willi syndrome can't. But there are general core issues that people with Prader-Willi syndrome share that get in the way of being able to engage fully in society and may impact more seriously on their mental health. So I've just listed there, it may be the extent and nature of their behaviors of concern. If someone has very severe emotional outbursts and frequent emotional outbursts, that's a problem. If someone's hyperphagia is such that even with good food security, they try and continue to seek out food, that's a problem. But there'll be other people whose hyperphagia is not as intrusive as this. And with good food security, everything works very well. Physical and mental health, and one should never forget the physical side of things. People with Prader-Willi syndrome can have physical illnesses that can go unnoticed until they get seriously ill, which in turn impact on mental health. I guess one of the best examples of that is sleep apnea. And any of us know, it's common sense, if you're not sleeping well, you're going to be grumpy. These physical conditions impact on mental health. But I think also, and I think this is an interesting one, and I don't know if those of you have perhaps younger children versus those of you with older children. I think we're seeing a generational difference. So that when I was first in the field of Prader-Willi syndrome, most children and the adults I would see with Prader-Willi syndrome wouldn't necessarily understand about having Prader-Willi syndrome. They may not even use the words. I think children now, I don't know whether it's families are working closer with them, are helping them to understand that factor, that it doesn't determine who they are, but something that they need to consider and learn about and learn to manage. Is that your experience, that there's a greater acceptance, perhaps among younger people, of having Prader-Willi syndrome? Yeah, do you?
Yeah, we decided early on that we were going to tell him all the way through.
Yes, yeah.
He still has some time with it, but
Yeah.
we describe things as this is it, it's not a
Yeah.
living
Yes. So it's a father saying here that they've really worked throughout the life to help your son, you say, understand about Prader-Willi syndrome. And I think that's very important, because what the problem arises, of course, is that they don't understand that, and they reach when they reach adulthood, and they start challenging the system, you then have problems. Whereas if they're accepting of it, they can move into a group home or whatever, they can accept the need for food security. It just makes life 1,000 times easier. Whereas if they challenge it, it's a real difficulty. Yes? Right. Well, I think in a sense that's... Yes, sorry. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. What happens if you have a child that doesn't understand the fact that they have Prader-Willi syndrome? Right. Yeah. 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 So if you have to put them in a group home and they're saying, why do I have to go and live there? I mean, in a sense, this is exactly the challenge of the variety of needs in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. There will be people with Prader-Willi syndrome that may not recognize it, whether it is they don't understand it or whether it is, in a sense, they don't want to understand it, if you like. They're rebelling against that, would be another matter. It becomes a complicated issue, and it varies from country to country how you would respond to that. Because the truth is, how would you force someone to live somewhere if they didn't want to? Now, there may be laws that would allow you to make that happen, but it's more than the law. It's the practicalities, it's the morality of it, and so on. I think you just have to, I often think that experience is a very good thing. So if you can get someone with Prader-Willi syndrome to spend some time there in an environment that is suited for their needs, then there's a sense of relief, and their anxiousness goes down, and they may think to themselves, actually, this is not too bad. And I think people have talked about this in the conference, the community that's established. This may be the first time they have friends. Yeah. Yes.
So hopefully you can hear me because I don't have a microphone.
Yeah. I'll repeat it a little bit in a moment.
So my son lives in a group home, and he accepts the environment. However, he continuously thinks about what he will do.
Mhm.
When I come to him to take him out of it,
Right.
as an example, he's in this building right now.
Right.
So what about that? So he lives in a group home. He's been living in a group home for 2 years. When I visit him, he almost has a written list, but it's not really written. But he knows exactly what he wants to do when I take him out of it. What restaurant to go to, what he's going to order at the restaurant,
Yeah.
Yes. What DVDs he wants me to buy for him, and here in Florida, what he wants to do in the animal kingdom. So, in other words, he's not. My view as a layperson is that he's not really completely accepting of the group home because he sees it as confining.
Right.
And it's not. There are barriers, partially because of staff limitations to the group home.
Yes. No, I mean, I relate quite strongly to what you describe, and certainly have seen people in which that tension is there. I don't think there isn't an answer to these things. I mean, I think in a way, of course, everything is a balance, and in the end, you as parents, the judgment that you're trying to make about these things is, on balance, is this the right place for my son and daughter? Accepting, and all of us are liable, wherever we live in our lives, we will have grumbles about that. I mean, nothing is ever perfect, but on balance, is it the right thing for him? But what I do recognize is that there is a trouble about how you maintain the quality in a group home. And that's a real challenge. And when we come to a bit in a moment, I'm going to say, actually, the quality of that group home is so important in terms of mental health. But in the UK, the big challenge we have is that people who work in the care sector are not valued, they're not paid very well. We've got a problem that we won't allow people to come into our country to work, and we've got a deficit. We haven't got enough people because people like me are in the age of retirement, and there aren't enough people coming through who are younger, who want to work. So there's a real problem there. We might touch on this a little more when we come to look at the care environment a bit. So there's if you're thinking about mental health, I think obviously there's the issues that relate more directly to the person with Prader-Willi syndrome. Then to come to your point, there's the family and the close support network. And I put in there early diagnosis because certainly when I started seeing people with Prader-Willi syndrome, I was seeing adults mainly. Some of them had not been diagnosed into their teens or even adult life because the diagnostic tests were really relatively new. I mean, perhaps 10 years, 15 years old, but that's relatively new in sort of medical terms. So I do think an early diagnosis is really important so that families can then get the information and adjust to the unexpected being having a child with a disability who then is diagnosed as having Prader-Willi syndrome. And then access to information, I think, is so important. And this is where national associations and IPSWO the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization does this for countries where there is no national association. That's where national associations are so important. And the USA one, I think, was the first national association to be established. It's going to be 50 next year, in 2 years, in 2025. I mean, that's an enormous achievement. And it is a critical part. Having an association and having access to information is a critical part in helping the mental health of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. Because you as family or paid carers, if you don't understand Prader-Willi syndrome, you will not be able to help your child with Prader-Willi syndrome. And you won't get that information, or in the past you didn't get it from the professional side, you got it from the National Association, you got it from other parents and so on. There's a lot of research looking at the impact of having a child with a disability on the family. We'll come back to stress a bit later. But one of the things is how it affects people's financial resources and how it affects the quality and type of housing that they live in. And this, I'm sure, would be true of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. We mentioned that a parent might have to give up work and this sort of thing. And if, supporting someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, you need to try and protect your own mental health in order to protect their mental health. So the second component in this, from the person with Prader-Willi syndrome, is the immediate social care environment. The immediate family, the wider family, the social network, and so on. And then the final bit, I think, is society itself. And in the International Association, we hear horror stories about people living in countries where there's still enormous stigma about having a disability, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to show you a slide a bit later about this. But, if you want someone to engage in society, you need the support networks that allow them to. You need employment, supported employment. If you don't have supported employment, they can't get supported employment. So it really matters. If you don't have financial benefits available to you, now this may be a difference between America and what is seen as the socialist state of the United Kingdom, but there may be differences here. But we have actually a very good safety net. It's creaking, because the UK is creaking, but but I'm sure you have your benefit systems as well. This helps to maintain the integrity of the family and the resource of the family, if you have those systems. You have civil society, and by that I mean the national PWSA. You have various social networks, clubs. It may be your church, it may be Rotary, it may be whatever it happens to be. These things are important because they support you in your task of supporting your child. But also, if you live in a society where if your child is seen as having a disability, it results in rejection and stigma, that's not going to be good either. And to be honest, this is the bit that worries me more than anything else, because I think we see minorities being marginalized. It may not be people with disability, but historically it certainly was people with disabilities. And if that happens again, that will impinge upon your ability as a family to support your child with Prader-Willi syndrome. Now, any comments about those three things? We'll be going into some of those in a little more detail in a moment, but any comments? Yeah.
What you just mentioned right there about marginalization, that also obviously extends to all of the funding sources and resources available.
Yes.
But it also relates to the marginalization of other people, like care workers,
yes,
who are low paid,
yes,
often
yes,
women,
yes,
women of color,
yes,
all of those type of things. For instance, in the state of Florida, just a year and a half ago, the average salary in the state of Florida was $10.15 an hour.
Right.
It has since been raised to 15,
yeah,
but by 2026, the minimum wage here will be 15, and it's right back to where it was.
yeah, yeah,
So the discrimination
yeah,
ripples out.
yeah, yeah.
And it needs to be fixed at the larger levels in order for things at a local level to be operating properly.
Yes. Well, I couldn't agree more. I wonder if anyone disagrees with that perspective. No, no, I mean, absolutely. And this will be true in all highly resourced countries like Europe and North America. This is true. We do not value the support staff. And by doing that, we endanger the quality of the social care environment. By endangering the quality of the social care environment, we endanger the lives of the people they are caring for, and particularly endanger their mental health. So, no, absolutely. Any other thoughts about that? Yes, at the back.
I think what I'm finding with my son is that another barrier is to mental health is that PWS doesn't really fit in even with other special needs groups. So it's like Special Olympics is like a difficult scenario for my son sometimes.
Yes. And that impacts, you feel, on their ability to engage more fully. Yes, I think that's right. That is a dilemma, that, I think, yes.
I also wanted to say, with it being such a spectrum, and as the younger kids, more treatments come online and have the potential to make a living, and yet all of the services are income-based, and so we're in that weird place, like, do you have a savings account? Do you let your child earn a certain amount of money? So that's also another frustrating piece to this whole, like, resource question.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think that, to take that further, I think you see, particularly if your child with Prader-Willi syndrome is the older one in the family, they see their younger siblings leap ahead of them. So get a driving license and all those sorts of things, get married or whatever. And all those sorts of things are really a challenge to that person's self-esteem, their well-being, and so on. And you can't avoid that, but you can try and address it, I think. Okay. Yes.
One more comment. So one more comment about barriers is that, so my son is 24 right now. He does not have a high school diploma. He wants one.
Yeah.
He was not able to reach the level of a high school diploma simply because of, in Massachusetts, the testing was a barrier.
Right.
The minimal testing requirement for a high school diploma was a barrier to him.
Yes.
He came close to it within a number of points.
Yeah.
And then somehow he had to transition out of the, I'm not sure if this is turned on.
Yes, I think it is. Yeah.
He had to transition out of high school, whether he wanted to or not. He still wanted the diploma.
Yeah.
So at 22, he had to get out. So he still wants one.
Yeah.
But we're both frustrated because of the structure and the dynamics toward reaching that level.
Yeah.
He sees other people, like you said, with siblings.
Yeah.
His sister's an attorney, and his brother's a software engineer. And so he wants to be successful also, and not just be in a group home.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I think for someone who has insight into that difference, how different they are from their siblings or whatever, it is very hard. But of course, if you are addressing the issue with them from early on about it's not their fault, it's no one's fault, but they have this condition that we call Prader-Willi syndrome, and this does affect their abilities in various ways, at least there's a reason, an explanation that they don't seem to know, they won't come to believe that it is because they're lazy or whatever it is. But these are some of the realities that impacts on someone's life. I think what you do see is if you've got good services in place, you can see opportunities being made available for people with a learning disability or people with Prader-Willi syndrome that would never have existed before, and that allows the building up and the maintenance of some self-esteem. But it is about a societal response to that. It isn't about giving a tablet. And that's in a way, and I think that, if I remember rightly, yes. So I've said here, for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, having and maintaining good mental health and a sense of positive well-being and quality of life are not just issues for health services. They require a range of actions and activities, including from wider society and support services, access to funding, and to informed health support from the relevant disciplines, and the availability of guidance and advice as and when it's needed. Now, it may well be that what is required is formal treatment, but much of it isn't about formal treatment from a doctor. Now, this may be, I put this in with some hesitation. This is an odd slide, but I hope I can make the point about what I'm trying to make here. That what I've said here is legislation matters. And I want to hear from you from your different states in a moment about this, because I'd imagine these are more state issues than federal issues here in America. But in 1913, in England and Wales has legislation. Scotland has a different legislation, so it really refers to England and Wales. We had the Mental Deficiency Act, and the Mental Deficiency Act resulted in establishing what became called colonies and eventually became hospitals, and these were hospitals of 1,000, 2,000 people with, quotes, mental deficiency. And the reason for that is the belief at the time is that people with mental deficiency were a harm to society. They would lower the quality and value of society. They believed that it was linked to criminality, and so you segregated them away in the community. And when I first started in this field of intellectual disability, around London there were still these old hospitals. They're now all closed, of perhaps 1,000 people, all people who had, or not all of them, but almost certainly most of them would have had some level of intellectual disability. Then in 1971, there was an absolute sea change in this. We had a white paper called Better Services for the Mentally Handicapped, which said, actually, we really mustn't have these institutions. They are abusive, they don't encourage people to develop and lead independent lives. And it started a whole movement for closing these institutions, and it developed a positive attitude about people with disability. And then 30 years later, we had Valuing People, a new strategy for learning disability in the 21st century. And that emphasized the importance of allowing people independence and choice, but it also emphasized the importance of providing the level of support that they needed. The danger, and we saw this in mental health services, that if you close the hospitals but you don't provide anything else, you have a disaster. So it was very important that you developed local community services, many of which were not health services, but support services. So that was Valuing People. But also we had things like the Education Act. Before 1971, a local education authority could say, we're not going to allocate you to a school because I don't think you can be educated. I mean, it seems outrageous now. 71, you know, I was quite old at that time. I mean, it's not that long ago. I mean, it's really not that long ago. And then another Education Act, I think 81 or 82, I can't remember. If I was asked what has been the biggest advance and the best thing in terms of the mental health of people with intellectual disability, it was the Education Act. It suddenly allowed them to go to school and learn skills in a way that wasn't the case before. And we had the NHS and Community Care Act that was about developing local services. But we also had the Equality Act, much more recently, that requires businesses, organizations generally, government departments, to make, quotes, reasonable adjustments to accommodate the needs of someone with a disability within that company or within that club or whatever. So it's no excuse that this person in a wheelchair can't come to this club. You must provide a ramp or a lift. But the same sort of principle applies to someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. And we use this to make the case for Prader-Willi specific support. We say you need, in a school, to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate to the risk of hyperphagia in someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. And if you don't do that, you're breaking the law. So the point I want to make is that And this is where national associations become so important, or state chapters of your national association. If you've got some unjust law that is creating problems for your children with Prader-Willi syndrome, that's not going to be solved by a pill to your child. It's going to be solved by a campaign to change that law. And we must think about mental health and well-being in that broader sense. It may not happen so that it helps your individual child, because these things take time. But if you're thinking in the future, it's about getting these things right. Now, very interestingly, there's the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. The USA has not signed that convention. It's really interesting, that. And I'm not certain quite why that is. Almost every country in the world has. I think it may be because your system of guardianship actually clashes with the principles of the UN Convention. But the UN Convention really was about the fact that it recognized that people with disabilities were still being disadvantaged, that countries weren't making these adjustments necessary or providing the support necessary to help people with disabilities, and including people with Prader-Willi syndrome, to have a good life. So that's my point of this slide. Now, I use it because, from the UK, because obviously I know the system there. But have you experienced in your own state of laws or whatever that get in the way or don't help, or laws that do help? Yeah, right.
I'm from Alabama, and they passed a law.
Hold on, just wait for the microphone. Mm-hmm.
I'm from Alabama, and they passed a law there because of group homes and having issues of neglect and things on other people.
Yeah.
And they didn't like to see the things locked up.
Yeah.
They passed a law that no group home can lock food away from an individual, which precludes everybody with PWS.
Yes, yes.
So you can't have a group home with somebody with PWS in it to protect everybody else.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's a wonderful example, and I've heard of that in elsewhere in the world too. And it's the thing about that. It's an insult to people with disabilities because it says they're all the same. And if you had someone in a wheelchair and you said we're going to ban lifts in group homes, or no, or people would say that's nonsense. There has to be specificity. There has to be understanding, not only of the individual's needs, but needs that may relate to a particular group of people, such as someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, Massachusetts, I find that so many services provided when they're in school, lots of training and lots of things. 22,
yes,
they enter a world that all the things they learn, there's no place to practice them.
Yeah.
And they fall off a cliff of services.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing left.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Now, I've got a slide about transition to adulthood, so we might come to that. I'm just slightly how are we doing for time? Yes, slightly aware of time, but yes, we will come to that issue. So I now want to move to that second bit, which is you as families, but also professional care providers. And I just want to ask, look at a little bit of research that is being published about that. And just want to say, and of course I would say this, wouldn't I, because I'm involved in research, it is actually important that these things are documented by research and published in peer-reviewed journals, because it gives credibility. It's not that you as parents aren't credible. You clearly are. You are the people that have that lived experience. But of course, in terms of the government and the state or whatever it is, they're always trying to protect their spending of resources or whatever. And you need to be able to say there is unbiased, absolute definite evidence that this is the case. I mean, growth hormone use is the best example of that, where there is now a ton of evidence that shows it's beneficial. And some of you might have heard the filmed report from Brian Hughes about that we've done a study through IPSO that has, for example, shown that Prader-Willi specific homes make an enormous difference to people's lives in adulthood. To come back to your point, really, that sort of, if that gets published, that could be used in the case of Alabama and say, look, this is the evidence. Now, so we know that the families of children with Prader-Willi syndrome, particularly, I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but I'm just saying this is the research, experience high levels of stress, and that families turn to their immediate family and the wider family for support. And if you ask what's the thing that, and by the way, behavior is spelt with a U, just in case you think I can't spell. Behavior problems is what really contributes to that high level of stress. And I want to just come to this bit here, that the way I think we're now conceptualizing the broad mental health of people with intellectual disability, when we come to the individual with Prader-Willi syndrome, we'll discuss this in more detail, is that it arises because of an interaction between a biological vulnerability, including the impaired development of the hypothalamus, but also other areas of the brain, in the context of the environment in which they live. It's that interrelationship between biology and environment that is really very, very important here. And therefore, helping families maintain your resilience is very important. You're the people. I mean, it's easy for me. I used to go in, I'd be called in to see someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. I'd go in, I'd pontificate, and I'd leave. You were left with struggling with the fact that that person, your son or daughter, was hitting you or whatever it is. So it's really important for your child's mental health that you have the support and guidance that maintains your resilience in the face of this adversity or those adversities. And that's why if you're looking at the issue of the mental health of someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, the mental health and resilience of the family is very important. And the same will be true about the professional care providers. It isn't easy. It really isn't easy. And I don't need to tell you that. So it isn't easy for people who are being paid the minimum wage to care for it. And it's certainly not easy for you on a day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year basis to do it. So this is really, I think, very important. And there's some research that has sort of looked at how you best do that. But I just want to, I'm sorry, this may be difficult to see. This is taken from the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disability. And it's just talking about the importance of support in someone's life. And how, if you've got someone with a disability and you've got society, there's a mismatch between that person's ability and what is required in order to survive in society. And this is particularly the problem, to come back to the issue of adulthood, particularly a problem in adulthood, because it's in adulthood you need the more sophisticated skills which a person with Prader-Willi syndrome may not have. But it is the support that bridges that mismatch. You can't change it, the mismatch, but it's the support that mitigates the impact of that mismatch. And it's you, in childhood certainly, that is providing the support. It may be professional care providers in adulthood that are providing that support. And what we know in terms of helping families with resilience, and this is some of the research has shown this, is helping families to prepare for the different phases of Prader-Willi syndrome. There's obviously, and Marcelo, we were talking about diagnosis and the impact of diagnosis. There's that, but there's then helping families understand the shift from undereating to overeating, so the development of hyperphagia. Knowing about some of the problems that arise, with adolescence or with greater independence or transition to school and then transition to adult life, and so on and so forth. And helping families plan for the future. If there are services in place and expertise, it may be through your national association, it may be through your state, that help with this, we know that this helps families. And this in turn will help the mental health of your son or daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome. Having structured care plans. By that it may be just sort of how to deal with certain particular situations. And often we used to talk about when people have outbursts, the importance of people knowing what to do under those circumstances, so that you didn't have to think, and you knew what, and your person with your son or daughter knew what was going to happen. Now, they may not take any notice of it, but at least they knew. There was a familiarity with it. All these things have been shown to help the stress in families and to help manage some of these difficulties. So now, having talked about society, talked about the family environment and the importance of the family and the social care environment, let's move particularly to the mental health, the factors that impact on mental health and behavior in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. We're now focusing down on the individual and what is it about having Prader-Willi syndrome that impacts on mental health. And in IPSWA, we've been undertaking an extensive review of mental health. We call it our mental health initiative. And we've had families and experts from around the world meeting through Zoom, and then we had a workshop at our international conference in Limerick last year, and we're continuing this, and we have, I'm supposed to be writing it, and I'm a bit slow, but we have a report which will be coming out hopefully later this year. But it comes back to, I think, something I discussed a bit earlier, that I think increasingly we see Prader-Willi syndrome as an impairment of an atypical brain development. Now, often people use the phrase that it's a multi-system. Now, it affects other systems of the body, but that's usually secondary to the brain. It affects the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in the brain. The hypothalamus then affects growth hormone production and therefore growth. It affects sex hormone production and therefore sexual development. Hypotonia may be a major factor in causing the scoliosis. Hypotonia probably has its origins in the brain. So it's fundamentally a problem of the brain. And of course, mental health, as that earlier definition suggests, really, in a sense, good mental health requires good brain functioning. Psychological needs and mental health are rooted in the brain as well as in the environment where people live. And there's a lot of research that has clearly shown the characteristic features from cognitive impairments, particular behaviors that you all know about, and what we call particular abnormalities of mental state, mood instability, situational anxiety or anxiousness, affective disorder, mood disorders, and psychotic illness. So there are particular issues that make people with Prader-Willi syndrome at risk for mental ill health. And I use the term mental ill health in a very broad sense. So at risk for having behaviors or mental states that impact upon their ability to engage with society and have a good life. So the challenge here is to find the ways of managing those issues and ultimately, as has come up so many times in this meeting, to find treatments. And I do feel we're at a really important phase where there will be new treatments, for example, for hyperphagia or whatever, that will be transformative. But it's frustrating because we can't say whether it's a year, 5 years, or 10 years, but I think that it will happen. And I just want to try and give you a model for how I think increasingly we understand this. Now, you are the experts on your own son and daughter. You know what makes them happy, what makes them sad, what triggers an outburst or whatever. So there's always the issue of what is it that someone like myself, who doesn't have a son or daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome, what is it that I can offer? And I think what I can offer is a conceptual framework for you to think about why this is a problem for your son or daughter. And this is the way I think, and I think this thinking has developed really over just the last few years. I think it's, and so if you think about people with Prader-Willi syndrome having an atypical pattern of brain development, then this has certain consequences. So if we take the hypothalamus, which is rooted just down here, that means that they have greater problems than you or I for recognizing and bringing to consciousness those internal experiences that we recognize as part of life. Hunger, for example. This is a problem. The signals are almost certainly coming from the body, hitting the hypothalamus, but they're not reaching the cortex, the surface of the brain, which is important for consciousness. And it's, of course, the reason you switch or you stop eating or you slow down is because you're no longer feeling hungry. But if you don't have that experience of not feeling hungry, of feeling fuller, then you're not going to shut down your eating behavior. So this is known as interoception, the internal feelings of the body. And there's Janice Foster has talked about this a lot. It may be other sensations are affected as well. So the brain, for someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, their brain may not have an accurate model of their internal world. But the same is true for the external world. So we know that the surface, the cerebral cortex, is impaired in its development as well in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. We know that because they have cognitive impairments and so on. We know that from brain scanning studies and so on. So their ability to make sense of the social environment may be affected. To make sense of the social environment, you need to understand why, you need to be able to make a reasonable estimate, guess at why someone's behaving in the way they're behaving. Or are they smiling at you or not smiling at you, and so on. So someone with Prader-Willi syndrome may have a greater difficulty making sense of that external world. And Deepan Singh talked about this in his talk. What that creates is a level of uncertainty. And this, what I think we increasingly believe, is what people call anxiousness or anxiety. It's not an anxiety disorder. It's anxiousness because their sense of the world is impaired. Now, we have been shaped through evolution to be able to survive by having an accurate understanding of the world. We know who our enemies are and to whether to fight them or to run away from them, and so on and so forth. But for someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, that model is impaired. And I think the way we think about it is the problem for them is their input to the brain from the body and from the external world is aberrant or atypical. Their responses are appropriate for that atypical input. The trouble is those responses are not appropriate to the environment and their needs because they're predicated on an abnormal input. So it's a problem for them. When they say, and I think that might help to explain when they say to you, despite the fact that there's crumbs all over their face they haven't eaten, I think it sort of helps to explain that. Their model is partly, look, I'm feeling hungry, therefore of course I haven't eaten. So that's the way for me to think about it, and that's the impact on their mental health, is their ability to make sense of their bodily sensations and the external world. And this is why we talk about this phrase homeostasis. Homeostasis is the biological processes that happen in order to manage change in our environment. The most obvious one of homeostasis, sorry, thank you. The most obvious one of homeostasis, someone was been signaling at the back that I'd let the microphone drop, and they were frantic, and I was ignoring them completely. The most obvious example of homeostasis is temperature. I have to say, I'm close to shivering in this room, but that's to remain my temperature homeostasis. When I go outside, it's rather nice, but then I start sweating. That's to maintain the normal body temperature. Now, there's a wonderful neuroscientist called Damasio. I think he's Italian-American. Wonderful. And he has talked about how feelings are also an example of homeostasis. The ability, you feel hungry in order to maintain your energy intake. So you need to balance how much you eat against how much energy you use. And the feelings of hunger are to do that. Your feelings of anxiety or anger are to maintain homeostasis when faced with threat. You see a dangerous animal running towards you, of course you feel anxious, and it prepares you for action. Yeah, sorry. 4 minutes, okay. Yeah. Right. Anyhow, I think this is the way that increasingly we think about this. So then you can think about what is transition like for someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. It's problematic. Because what transition is moving, from, I'll just get back to, moving often from a structured to an unstructured environment. It's perhaps having more access to food, so uncertainty, having to try and manage that. Increasing choice and independence, and possibly less support. So transition is a really problematic time. Now, just to come back to some specific issues, I think this type of model of biological vulnerability and environmental circumstances can be applied to our understanding of emotional outbursts. This is from Janice's work. You know, we know what temper outbursts are like. They rapidly develop and then slowly resolve. Casey Bedard talks a lot about applied behavioral analysis, and that's very relevant as well, how the environment shapes when behaviors are going to happen. But the biology here is what's known as the autonomic nervous system, this ability to control emotionally your response to threat. And that's what we think vagus nerve stimulation might be correcting. So what then follows in terms of preventing outbursts is what can you do to make the environment more certain? You can't, at the moment, vagus nerve stimulation or something like that may make things easier in the future, but at the moment it's about making the environment more predictable and more certain. Just to say, just briefly, the risk of mental illness is an issue, more particularly in people with the UPT type of mental illness, UPT type of Prader-Willi syndrome. But to emphasize many times, it is treatable. So if someone becomes mentally ill, it is treatable. And it is the one situation where you should be using medication. Now, this is a cultural difference. I think you shouldn't be using medication in lots of other situations, but you should certainly be using it in this situation. It's a lifesaver if someone is genuinely and truly mentally ill as a psychotic illness. So this is the last slide. So what I've tried to do is to put mental health and well-being in this wider context, from the person with Prader-Willi syndrome and the importance of early intervention, informed support, skills development, and so on, to the family and the importance for the family to have information and understanding, to have support, to have issues that help address problems with finance or housing, in order that you are strong and robust so you can support your son and daughter with Prader-Willi syndrome and help maintain their mental health. And that you live in a society in your state that is accepting of people with disabilities and provides services for people with disabilities. Now, obviously, the person with Prader-Willi syndrome may not access those services if they have problems, but if they are able to, but there are no services, that we said earlier, then there are problems. So you need each bit of this jigsaw to be in place to really help maintain the mental health of someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. So I think that was my last slide. But any final comments or questions? Have we got a couple of minutes, Michelle, or we? Just, yeah.
Well, I just had a comment about that society piece. If anybody in the room is involved in the advocacy committee with PWS, can you raise your hand?
Right.
There's several of us in here. It's a growing arm of PWSA,
Good.
and we've done our first DC fly-in last year. We took 50 people to Washington, D.C. to talk to legislators, and it's really robust. And Christy's here. I know that she did great work in, are you in Arizona, with the legislator getting PWS, trying to get PWS as part of SSI, right? Or no, as the waiver program, as a qualifier.
Right.
So PWSA will support you in your efforts locally and nationally, and we'd love to see more people get involved with that. So.
Absolutely. Well, that's wonderful. I mean, that fits absolutely, and that's what all national associations should be doing, and state chapters in your case. Yeah. I think there was someone just here.
Thank you. I'm wondering how the conceptual models of neurodiversity
Right.
kind of fit.
Yeah.
I mean, much of when you talk about the supports in the system, that says we want to be more inclusive.
Right.
And yet, I think it's a fine line. Do we look at this as a disability or as a neurodiversity?
Right. I think we have to finish now, don't we? No. I say that because I think that's a really challenging and interesting question. And I think the answer is that there are times we think of it as neurodiversity, and there are times that we think of it as disability. And you use it depending on what is right for the circumstances. That would be my answer to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
everyone.
Dr. Holland. Thank you.